and has served in various policy roles in the White House, Department of Defense, and State Department. And our moderator, Mckay Coppins, is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he reports on national politics and the Trump presidency. He was previously a reporter for BuzzFeed News, where he covered 2 presidential campaigns and served as the site's first political editor. He is also the author of The Wilderness, a book about the battle over the future of the Republican Party. I will return later to moderate the audience Q&A, but now please join me in welcoming our panel.
These are quite something, these seats are.
Very nice chairs.
Like Star Trek.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to our esteemed panelists here, and of course to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. As we sit down, I feel like this is what we need to start with. We are apparently on the brink of a government shutdown. So let's start off with that happy news. David, what's going on?
This is a great way to pass the time before a government shutdown.
Well, I mean, look, I think what makes this so strange is that we have one party that controls both chambers of Congress and the White House. How has this happened? How have we gotten to this point? What
Well, in a sense, this is a microcosm of the polarity that we've seen, each side under pressure from their own bases. That's part of what's playing out here. You know, the Republicans are in the thrall of their activist base and on issues like immigration. Democrats, there's a lot of pressure on Democrats around this issue of DACA and the fact that this has been deferred several times. So that's a play. And then you have the, you know, we were just saying before you came out, what better way to mark the first anniversary of Donald Trump's presidency than with a government shutdown? He adds this element. I mean, nobody has done more in the last 10 days to ensure that we reach this point than Donald Trump. And so, you know, he has governed in a way that is chaotic, and he has handled this in a way that is chaotic, and he has taken a bad situation and he's made it worse.
I agree with what David said about both parties being constrained by their base, but I think the shutdown is fully and squarely on the president. He is the one who submitted a budget that was dead on arrival in the Congress. He is the one who failed to suss out and cajole trade space for different legislation than the budget itself. He's the one who was throwing Molotov cocktails in as the party leadership were trying to craft a way forward. The president owns this one.
Tim can defend him.
Yeah, so Tim, now make the president's case.
No, I was actually going to mention, you know, I wanted us to mention something about all those poor civil servants who are learning that they're not essential anymore. I was in government when we nearly had a government shutdown, and I got the memo, and I realized I wasn't an essential member of the government anymore, and that was really hard. And there are many people who are just figuring out that tomorrow they may not have a job for a while.
The Congress, by the way, is not among them. They are going to get paid regardless.
Well, listen, the beauty of, one of the things about our system is that we may have separation of power. We do, but Congress gets a lot of authority. Congress has managed to exempt itself from things such as the Freedom of Information Act. Don't get me started. Anyway, I'm not going to defend the president. He can do that on his own. I think something you have to keep in mind, and I haven't heard it enough lately. I believe the reason why the Democrats are actually holding out for DACA is there's a deadline. It's not as if the Democrats are holding out to have comprehensive immigration reform or some comprehensive new tax approach, which would be irresponsible. Brinkmanship for that is irresponsible. But we're talking about a real deadline that the president set up,
right.
And that deadline is March.
It's March 5th. Well, but the thing is, Tim, that and look, you talk about the hardship that will be felt by civil servants. I think of those 800,000 young people who are here not of their own volition and really know no other country, and who are doing all the right things and were extended essentially an understanding, and now feel like their lives are being threatened by this. I feel very deeply for them. The question is just whether or not, since it is a March 5th deadline, and I know it's a rolling kind of thing, so some are already being impacted, a short-term solution, a short-term answer here only brings us closer to a deadline that I actually don't think the Republicans want to breach. This is an 80% issue with Americans. I watched that footage, many of you did as well, of that fellow in Detroit, that poor guy who went back after 30 years, was sent back to Mexico, separated from his family. He isn't even a dreamer, but imagine that story multiplied hundreds of thousands of times in every media market in this country. This is not something the Republican Party can afford. So the closer you get to the deadline, the more I think they're under pressure to come up with a solution. I am sympathetic to Democrats wanting to use the leverage they have. The question is whether the leverage point should come now or 2 or 3 weeks from now.
Well, that's a good point. Let me ask you this, though. Why haven't, it seems, at least on paper, we were talking about this backstage, at least on paper, both parties say that they want to fix the DACA problem, right? So, you know, the last time the government shut down, it was over an issue that the parties genuinely disagreed on. It was funding for Obamacare, right? This is an issue that theoretically the vast majority of the country and most members of Congress in both parties want to fix. Why can't they just get together? It shouldn't be that hard, right? Especially we have a master deal maker in the Oval Office.
But it involves compromise. And I guess one of the things that we'll discuss and maybe we'll get questions about is why there is no spirit of compromise. Mm-hmm. That compromise, I mean, I think the Washington Post had a very interesting op-ed about, or actually editorial about it, would involve paying for some of the wall.
Right.
And that sounds like a good deal if in return you help 800,000 people. And you know, the wall...
This is what I was going to say. Why don't Democrats just say, okay, fine, we'll give you money for the wall?
But well, wait a second. Let's be pragmatic about this. How do you do that? I mean, David, maybe you had to in your job, it'll be with foreign countries, but you've had to negotiate. You don't want to negotiate publicly. Right. I presume that Schumer has talked about giving money for the wall, but he's not going to say it publicly. I mean, I assume that that's been said. And I hope so.
Well, certainly the bipartisan deal that was cut among that gang of 6 included compromise on both sides, and that should be a foundation for future negotiation. But here's the difference between Democrats and Republicans on this issue. I think Democrats genuinely want to solve this problem. I think Republicans feel they have to. And I don't think they're terribly enthused about it. Their base is deeply opposed to it. You've made a study of that Republican base. To those folks, it's amnesty. Mm-hmm. And I will say this, as a matter of just practical politics, without making any judgments, I think there is a little bit of danger for some of these Democrats who are running in Trump states, Claire McCaskill in Missouri, right. Donnelly in Indiana, and then some of the districts where seats are up for grabs. If this thing is portrayed as shutting the government down simply on this issue, and you can see that in some of the polling.
Yes.
There's great enthusiasm for DACA. There's not as much enthusiasm for shutting the government down if it's perceived as for DACA, which is why you now hear Democrats in the last 48 hours saying this isn't about that, this is about all these short-term CRs. We've got to stop governing like this. This is about chaos. This is about bad governance, because they're not that eager to turn it into a showdown solely about DACA.
Well, we saw how Democrats fared in an election that was all about immigration, right? Or at least right. Largely about immigration. Corey, you said that this is squarely on the president's shoulders at the end of the day. Make the case, because it is true that there was a bipartisan deal a few days ago. Democrats and Republicans got together, brought a deal to the White House, and the meeting did not go well. That is the famous meeting where he said a word that I won't say here. You know, we clearly, it seemed like a deal was within reach and the president blew it up. Why?
I think a fundamental lack of discipline on the president's part, an inability to focus on the most important things that need doing, and to do it in a way that makes people see an interest in adopting what he wants. I mean, didn't Mitch McConnell say, as soon as we know what the president wants, we can bring a bill to the floor?
Yeah.
That the Senate Majority Leader is in doubt about the president's priorities?
Well,
Like,
really what he was saying is,
7 months after
we
they
are not going to
submitted the
walk
budget?
the plank on a bill and have the president saw that plank off
Right.
behind us, is what the majority leader was really saying.
So compromise requires trust, and the president doesn't have it. And the president being able to force the legislative body to adopt his priorities requires his ability to both reward and punish them. And I don't think people any longer believe he has the ability to do either of those things.
Well, and in a way, Tim, that is the story of the first year of the Trump presidency, or at least one of them, right? This president, you hear it from Republicans on Capitol Hill, Democrats, this is not somebody that they feel like they can negotiate with in good faith. They have no idea where the White House is going to be at any given moment, and that has actual real-world consequences.
Well, I was going to say, let me take you into an alternate universe.
I thought we were talking about that.
No, we're going to take you in another one. The president gives an inaugural address where he promotes himself as a man beyond and above party, who's willing to do things neither party is willing to do, because he really is not a man of any party. He proposes real infrastructure reform, and he lays out a vision for the country that actually could bring it together. Now, that's not what happened. And I think this year is a story of a sectarian government. He has been the president of the red states, not the president of the United States. He's been given so many opportunities to bring us together. Charlottesville, for me, was the test. It was the litmus test, because Charlottesville was a moment. Imagine Ronald Reagan in the Charlottesville moment, Barack Obama, John F. Kennedy, even Richard Nixon. They would have used that opportunity to remind us of our better angels. And this president got a frog in his throat. He started out, he tried, he couldn't do it, his heart wasn't in it, and finally what he came out with was something very divisive. So, to my mind, what happened in that meeting last week was proof that this president is afraid of his base. He's not leading his base, he's afraid. And what happened was he had a very good bipartisan agreement which would have made him into that president that I think Democrats are afraid he might become. Ross Perot on steroids, if you will, or on Diet Coke in his case. But he didn't. He got scared. Cotton and Perdue come to him.
Well, and his own staff, let's be clear about that.
But it's a weird thing for a man, a billionaire, who's basically run a family company all these years, to be afraid of his own staff.
Well, it's a weird thing for a guy who's had his background to be president of the United States.
Well, we got that too.
Well, David, actually talk about that, because you've been in a White House. I mean,
yeah, and you know, I think more than anything else, what I find appalling, I mean, other than his sort of serial degradation of institutions, which I think are important to democracy, the thing that is so striking to me is how ill-prepared he is. I mean, Ivo knows and worked for President Obama. I used to watch him go home with a several-foot stack of papers every night to be ready for the next day. I was never in a meeting in the 2 years that I worked in the White House where he wasn't thoroughly prepared and hadn't thought about the issues and thought about it in ways that others hadn't thought about, and was a sort of active participant in these discussions. Most of the time, you get the sense that this president doesn't have a clue about what's going on. You know, during that whole health care debate, you may remember Barack Obama sitting down with the leaders of Congress of both parties at the Blair House for 7 hours on C-SPAN talking about health care. Donald Trump couldn't carry on a conversation like that for 7 minutes because he doesn't do the work. And so I don't think, and I'm not sure what his convictions are on some of these issues. I think on trade, he actually has a long-standing view of it. I think it's the wrong one, but he has it. On this one, I don't even know. I mean, I think immigration was a good issue for him and did rally his base. But I don't know that, I don't think he's studied the ins and outs of this thing. And I think it seemed cool on Tuesday, we're going to have a bill of love, a week later or 9 days later. Was it that much?
It wasn't even that long.
No, it wasn't that long. He's about to, he asked for a bipartisan bill. He's about to get this bipartisan bill. His staff is alarmed because they are hardliners on immigration. They call in, Cotton and Perdue to scuttle the thing. And it's as if the President of the United States is like a bit actor. The only thing he contributed was vulgarity. So, it's really frightening to me.
And as a journalist who covers this presidency, it is remarkable the degree to which you talk to people in the president's orbit, and they talk about him often like a problem to be managed or a person to be handled more than their boss, right? So I wanted to ask you, Corey, I mean, Tim talked about Charlottesville. When you look back over the past year, is there a particular moment or episode or issue that stands out in your mind as kind of defining or capturing this first year of the Trump presidency?
On foreign policy, it would be the President of the United States asking his national security team why Iraq should be different from running a restaurant in Manhattan, right? Like, I think he actually doesn't, where we have gotten good outcomes on foreign and defense policy, it has been because the president appointed people who have different views than he did, and either got bored or enervated enough, or maybe even persuaded, that he let them take him to a place where he didn't want to be. I think that's true on Syria policy, it's true on Afghanistan policy, it's true on Iraq, and it's true on alliances grudgingly, but not in a persuasive way. I think my counterpart to David's point would be that on trade, on alliances, and on immigration, President Trump has been immutable since the 1980s. No amount of information has permeated his very strong ideological opposition to those three things. And so everyone around him is trying to contain what are fundamentally destructive reflexes on the part of the president.
But you hinted at this.
Look at that. That's a strong defense. I'll have to yield to that.
This is a question for all three of you. On those issues, and in general on foreign policy, has he been better or worse? Have things ended up? I don't personalize it about the president, but have the outcomes been better or worse than you expected 1 year ago when he was inaugurated?
Well, look, I mean, one thing we were talking about trust earlier. Under the aegis of this group, I think it's an important thing to talk about, and the council has talked about it. Trust is as important in negotiations and in achieving things globally as it is domestically. And, the Gallup poll just came out I think yesterday or the day before, and, the approval rating globally of the United States has plummeted 20 points in 1 year.
Currently, I have it right here, currently at 30%.
1 point below China.
1 point below China, the lowest it's ever been since they've been doing this. And in President Obama's last year, it was at 48%. So in just a year, it's gone down.
That doesn't necessarily, and these guys can speak to it, it doesn't necessarily, there's not a straight correlation there between effectiveness. I mean, if you're pursuing a policy, if you have a coherent policy, but it seems to me concerning generally if you want to engender cooperation, because politics, one thing I learned working in the White House is what Tip O'Neill said about politics in the U.S. is true globally as well. All politics is local. And if it is unpopular to be involved with the United States and the President of the United States, it makes it more difficult for you to do hard things in the world together.
So I think it depends on what you take as the baseline. One of the real challenges in the Trump era is not accepting what Trump wanted to do as the baseline for whether the policy is better, right? Because a lot of policies are a lot better than we had any right to expect with Donald Trump's election, right? Russia policy, but not because of the president, because Congress boxed the president in. I think policy, so the question I think to ask is how different is Trump policy on foreign, how different are the outcomes for Trump policy on foreign policy than they would have been in a Clinton administration? I think you probably would have had very similar policies on Afghanistan. You probably would have had very similar policies on the ISIS fight. Russia, only because Congress intervened. I think you have very different policy on Korea than you would have had in a Clinton administration. I think you have very different policies. We are paying a much higher price for almost every policy, even if it is the same than what a Clinton administration would have done, because of the president lighting everything on fire, right? Like not willing to commit to Article 5 for the NATO allies. So almost no matter how many troops he sends to Europe, Europeans are still anxious about the Russian threat because the president's fundamentally unsound on Russia and because he's unwilling to do the traditional things that have made the United States a comforting and reliable partner to its allies. So across the board, even where we've gotten good outcomes, we've paid a much higher price for it because of the president's behavior.
I was going to say the good news is that 7 decades of international engagement has left some institutions that one man cannot destroy in 1 year. And those institutions are at home and abroad. But that doesn't mean that 4 years of this stress test is not going to result in a much weaker international system. But let's not forget one other thing. We have allies, and it's not in their interest for us to fail. Even if they don't like our president, there are all kinds of reasons, whether it's because they hold our currency as a reserve currency, whether it's because they trade with us, whether it's because they need our military, they don't want us to fail. And so one of the costs that I think Corey was referring to was the cost for our allies of having to be much nicer to the United States than they really would like, much nicer to Donald Trump than they would like to be. And there are some political difficulties for those allies to do that because they have far-right extreme movements in many of these countries that view Donald Trump as the avatar. And for them to be embracing this man, but they have to embrace him. He is the president of the United States. They have to embrace the United States. But I think some of the cost is being borne by our allies as much as it's being borne by us. So 1 year of this stress test, we're doing pretty well. 4 years of this stress test, I don't know. But, let's be, one of the things, what this council represents, like all councils like it throughout this country and elsewhere, are people who are committed to international engagement. The good news is, your commitment is stronger than 1 year of a disruptive presidency. The question is, 4 years, what then happens?
We're parochial here in Chicago, so we don't want to.
Don't talk about any other council.
We don't want to suggest that there are others comparable.
Oh, I'm sorry. So you have set, there's a council in New York where I live, but who cares? You have set the standard. The gold, is that fair or platinum? Do we have to go?
Platinum would be good.
Okay.
One other cost that the Trump administration is imposing in how it's doing things is that the likelihood for large-scale failure is higher in a Trump administration because the president is so idiosyncratic and because he's so volatile. And Korea in particular is a very risky, this is a problem without a large margin for error, and the president is being extraordinarily reckless.
So let me ask about Korea. I want to ask all of you about this because there is a school of thought among perhaps wishful thinkers and certainly Trump defenders that this president, this administration is more calculating when it comes to Korea than his tweets would let on. That he's trying to scare them, that he's, you know, this is a way to put pressure on the regime. Do you see any credibility to that argument? And what would you think of that strategy?
So I don't think it's true, but for purposes of argument, here's how.
Let's pretend it is.
Here's how I think it would play out, which is that the president clearly believes that there is no cost to setting all boats rocking, right? That any negotiation where everything's in play is a negotiation where he can make a better deal over the status quo. What he fails to, so that would be the argument for the madman theory.
The madman theory,
right? But the problem is, he's not the only madman in this equation, right? Like, and the associated costs of having the guarantor of the international order, the country that others rely on for their security guarantees, to be playing so fast and loose with tens or hundreds of thousands of South Korean and Japanese casualties that's an enormous cost to pay in every other relationship we have in the world. So even in the best case where General McMaster is shrewdly working the calibration of this, and the president's a mastermind in messaging the North Koreans on this, there's a very high likelihood of getting it wrong. Right? Because North Korea is the most isolated country in the world. The probability of us having a virtuosity of understanding about how to play the messaging with a country like North Korea, almost certainly not true.
I want to hear from you too, but let me just you don't think that that's true. You don't think that that's what the president is doing. You really think that when he's tweeting insult comedy at Kim Jong-un, that it's literally just that without any strategy, without discussing it with anyone, he's just popping off on Twitter?
Well, he's so
Yes.
temperate in every other way.
That's right.
I just want that's the consensus here.
Well, I don't know if this, look, he doesn't have to talk about the size of his button. But I want to say one thing about this madman theory, just so you know, okay, that it comes from Richard Nixon, and he tried it out for only a few months in 1969, and he dumped it. And what he did instead was he tried to build real relationships with Russia, or Soviet Union, and China, based on mutual respect and trust. You can't play the madman game if you want Beijing to work with you. So the United States junked this. And the idea that we would want to revive a strategy that was used by Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon for 9 months in 1 year and was proved to be a failure makes no sense to me. So I don't believe it. Even old Kissinger, who likes to participate still in foreign policy, wouldn't be recommending a policy he himself junked. But the other issue, and this is the tough one for us, I think, and I'm going to be, I'm sure, the outlier here. My study of non-proliferation proves to me that it's very hard to prevent proliferation. The United States has tried it in a number of cases. The United States did not want Israel, for example, to have nuclear weapons. Tried hard, failed. Did not want India to have it. Did not want Pakistan to have them. Very hard to prevent states that want nuclear weapons to get them. We now know that Korea is a nuclear state. It may not be able to deliver them effectively, but it's a nuclear state. I do not understand the rationale of scaring them so that they'll give you their gun. It's like going to someone and saying, I'm going to kill you, give me your gun. I don't understand the logic. So if someone could explain to me why you would use Henry Kissinger's rejected madman nonsense against a state that already has nuclear weapons so that they'll denuclearize, I don't understand the logic in any case.
Well, David, it does seem like the madman theory might just be something that was kind of grafted on after the fact,
Totally.
because
I think
a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment think that an actual madman is in the Oval Office, right?
Well,
I mean, what do you think of this?
No, look, I think that he, in his own way, I do think he's reactive. First of all, let's stipulate that. I mean, he wakes up in the morning and he sees something on Fox and Friends, and he's off to the races. And whether it's about Kim Jong-un or Dick Durbin or whatever, I mean, and he doesn't give it a whole lot of forethought. But I'm going to repurpose your question and make a couple of other points. One of the signature qualities of President Trump's or components of President Trump's campaign was early and often to talk about how China was taking advantage of the United States and how he was going to get tough on China. I think it's fair to say that China has never gotten a greater gift than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
By summarily withdrawing from the TPP, from withdrawing from global leadership, and leaving a tremendous void that the Chinese are eager to fill, he has given them an extraordinary gift. And so that's one point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that from the standpoint of foreign policy, we are seeing the sort of slow destruction of our diplomatic corps. We've seen the senior strata of the State Department leaving in large numbers. We see fewer younger people signing up for the diplomatic corps. And I think it's going to take a long time to repair that damage. But when you send a signal that you really don't believe in diplomacy, and that's the signal that the president has said. I mean, can you imagine if you were the Secretary of State and you were in China trying to pursue a diplomatic solution to this situation in North Korea, and the president tweeted, "I told Rex not to waste his time." Yeah. I mean, how do you function in an environment like that? So, I mean, I think there are really serious, I believe in the durability of our institutions, but I fear for them as well. And the global institutions, I think, are, you know, and here I'm straying into territory that others in this room have greater expertise in, but I feel there's more fragility in these global institutions, and there's more of an opportunity for other players to game them. So I'm really concerned about what 4 years of this will bring.
Well, we have a few minutes left, so let me ask you this. To end on a hopeful note, is there, you know, is there any chance of the president or people around him at least turning things around in the next year, in this year to come? You know, obviously he's not going to become a Democrat. He's not going to change his personality or temperament. But are there reasons to be hopeful that something could change in the next year that if not reverses the damage, at least slows the damage that you've all been describing
I'm
today?
looking at this paper to see who the hopeful one's supposed to be.
Yeah.
You do have a history of talking about hope.
No, look, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful about our democracy. And I mean, I think the hopeful story about the first year has nothing to do with Donald Trump. The hopeful story about the first year is how resilient our democratic institutions have been. The media, our judicial system, even the Congress, you know, hasn't gone along with him in the way that he thought that they would, even though his party controls both houses of Congress. And most importantly, citizens. You see an aroused citizenry, and there'll be an election in November. I suspect that that election is going to be a very harsh verdict on the first 2 years of the Trump administration. So I'm hopeful about that. You know, as far as the world goes, you know, I'll leave it to my friends to talk about what makes them, what would leave them hopeful there. I think what you have right now are some, you know, very solid people in some key positions who are trying to limit the damage that this president does. But the thing that I know will not happen is I don't think this president's going to change. I don't think he's going to sit there and say, well, let me take stock of how this last year went and see how I could be a better president. That doesn't seem to, that's just not within his emotional range. His behavior in many ways seems pathological to me, and I don't think those habits change.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with David's judgment. Where I am hopeful is that on the issues where the president has had to make big, discrete foreign policy decisions, Afghanistan, Syria, to some extent the Iran agreement, My expectation was his decisions would be much worse than they are. So there are constraining factors that over time have gotten some traction on the president.
How about Jerusalem?
I am skeptical, like there's a lot of other stuff that he has gotten wrong. I'm skeptical, though, that on many of the issues that are going to come across the president's plate in the coming year, recertification of the Iran agreement, again, which he's already said he wasn't, implementation of the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem, Korea, whether to continue backing the Saudis and how to do what needs doing in the Middle East, given the Saudi behavior towards Qatar. All of those problems, I'm much more skeptical. I think the president's actually made reasonably good decisions on the easy stuff where the answers were obvious. I think on the harder stuff, he's much likelier to get it wrong. Where I am hopeful, though, is that I disagree with David. I think the liberal international order is a lot more resilient, a lot closer to what Tim says, that in fact, as the Japanese, the Australians, and the Canadians and the South Koreans have shown, they are moving ahead with the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership and buying us time to get our act together. I think European allies are doing a good job of that. I actually think the order is much more resilient because everybody has an interest in it being sustained and not letting it collapse.
Well, let me say that I did stipulate that I had less expertise than you. So I'm going to leave here relieved.
Hope restored for David Axelrod.
My sort of cheerier comment has to do with democracy, and it also has to do, oddly enough, with our military. I say oddly enough because we are very proud to have civilian control of our military, but I think when historians will look back on this year, they're going to see what a remarkable role our military played in stabilizing our country. This year, transgender individuals can join our military. We have a government that would like to use the Department of Justice to discriminate against transgender men and women, but our military won't. Just think about the implications. Think about what that means. I'm not saying that there is a shadow government in the military. I don't believe that at all. But what I do believe is that we have a much stronger set of institutions in this country with people who share values that are not the same as those of the president. The second point I wanted to make was that gerrymandering is a product of a stasis, of actually a withering away of democracy in our country. The Trump presidency is invigorating people to vote and think about what it means to be in a democracy. That can't hurt us. That cannot hurt us. And maybe you will argue, some people will argue, God, why did we have to go through this if you're of that inkling? The fact is it's healthy. And the people on the streets, nonviolently, protesting, the people who are much more interested in Congress, the people who are going to those meetings with Congress and asking questions.
Or running for Congress.
They're running for Congress who might not otherwise have run for Congress. You know what? That makes us all better. So that's my hopeful note.
All right, thank you. Thank you to everyone on the panel. I think we're going to take some questions now from the audience.
Gentlemen, we now have time for your questions. For our live stream audience, please feel free to direct your browser to chi.cnf.io. For our in-person audience, if you have a question, please raise your arm. Once I've acknowledged you, a member of our staff will bring a microphone to you. And please make sure your question is a question. Yes, ma'am. In the blue shirt, please.
There's been a lot of discussion early on about the delay in setting up all the senior people and all the secretaries for all the different departments. I'm in the food industry, so we hear about it with FDA. It's gotten quiet. Are those positions filled? Or are we still hanging on with a lot of unknowns? And where do we see that going?
So I can only speak for the national security space, but of the 560 or so senior appointees in foreign and defense policy and in everything that touches the world, the president has only nominated half of them.
Dave? David, did you want to add something? I saw you shaking your head.
No, I think that sort of speaks for itself. And I think the State Department has felt that
Yeah.
very significantly. I mean, it was just December when he nominated the Assistant Secretary who would be dealing with Korea and
We don't have an
China.
ambassador in Korea.
Yeah, we don't have an ambassador in South Korea. So, yes, I am one who believes that Donald Trump didn't expect to be president. I don't think, therefore, he was prepared when he became president. And I don't think they've done a very good job of catching up, in part because of chaos within the administration.
I think that's true. I would just add one thing, which is that there's also an ideological component to this. Steve Bannon, who was the chief strategist of the Trump White House, actually said, while still chief strategist, that he was out to deconstruct the administrative state.
Yes.
Which is to say, basically dismantle much of the federal government. So at least with some in Trump's orbit, that I don't think that's the view of everyone in this White House, but certainly there were some early on, and probably some who are still in this administration, who deliberately are trying to slow that process.
He also said Donald Trump Jr. was guilty of treasonous behavior. Now he says he didn't mean it. So, so maybe he didn't mean that.
Yeah, so he probably takes it back.
We'll go to a question from our online audience. Can you speak to the devolving relationship between this White House and the national media, and what are the long-term implications?
As a member of the national media, I'll start.
Why don't you do that?
You know, the Arizona Senator Jeff Flake actually just gave a speech this week on the Senate floor on this very subject, and I talked to him yesterday about it, where he talked about the dangers that he sees of what he called the presidential assault on journalism, free press, and truth. The thing that I think is look, there's a long history, I've written about this in my book and elsewhere, there's a long history in Republican politics of going after the press. This goes all the way back to Barry Goldwater, arguably earlier. You know, to be fair, there are legitimate complaints and have been in the past about liberal bias, but what's shifted in the past few years, and certainly with Donald Trump, is that it's not, the critique isn't just that there's bias in the press or that the press is unfair. The critique is now elevated dramatically to the point where the president is saying that the press is they're enemies of the people. The thing that I most worry about is not necessarily, you know, look, Donald Trump in a lot of ways has, in the short term, been good for the bottom line of a lot of media companies. It's driven a lot of clicks to websites, a lot of viewers to newscasts. The Atlantic has seen a spike in subscribers. Thank you, Mr. President. But what I worry about is the partisanization of the press, the kind of growth of the Breitbarts of the world and the kind of isolated right-wing and left-wing echo chambers. It makes it more and more so that for vast swaths of the country, there is no agreed upon set of facts that we're all starting from. And that makes it harder for certainly any kind of political consensus to be reached, but also for us to even have constructive debates at all on issues, because we're all starting from such different places with different realities almost.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the great challenge of our time, you know, is the environment that social media in particular has created, but the ability to create kind of virtual reality universes in which the only information you get affirms your point of view rather than informs your point of view. And I must say, you know, Democrats, if you look at polling, have more varied media sources, but at least insofar as television goes, it is astonishing how much Fox News has consolidated that cohort, Republican cohort, and if they choose to function as a kind of state media, that's concerning. Having said all that, I repeat what I said earlier. I'm really impressed by the journalism that's been done. I think journalists have felt challenged in this era to do what journalists were meant to do and why they're so prominent in our Constitution, and that is to shine a bright light in dark corners and hold our government officials accountable. And I think people, not since the age of Watergate, Tim, have reporters seen themselves, seen their role in that light. I mean, so I think that's been very positive.
I agree with that. I think that the president has been actively seeking to intimidate journalists, and failing to intimidate journalists is the great, beautiful functioning of American liberty. But he is gleefully playing with fire and encouraging violence against journalists, encouraging disbelief of actual journalism in a way that's really bad for the country.
The fake news appellation is poison, and we see dictators are using that term against their own people. Not that they wouldn't find, they look for ways to do it in other ways, but
They don't need
but,
to.
but they don't need. But imagine quoting the United States,
the President of the United States.
We used to be the ones. We talking about gold standards or platinum standards. We used to be the gold standard for talking about liberty and freedom of speech. We talked about Jeffersonian values. Now we're now providing the world with an example of a president who was talking about fake news. One of the exciting, we're in that moment. I mean, we're in that one of those moments in history, and this political moment is converging with a technological moment. It's unclear whether our technological sophistication is going to make us more sophisticated politically or not. I think there was a similar debate in the 1920s about radio and what effect radio would have. Would radio actually create these little groups of people only listen to radio about the countries they came from as immigrants? Turned out that wasn't the long-term effect. You've got fireside chats ultimately, and a lot of other things too, but we don't know yet.
And Rush Limbaugh.
And, well, that was the decline. There's a good. You're feeling a little negative now, but here's the cool thing. Now, I mean, I'm a teacher, right? So I'm not going to be a cynic. If I'm a cynic, I shouldn't be a teacher. We took the filters away. Okay, that's what it. There used to be filters. There were 3 channels, and that's right, the gatekeepers, and they're gone. So the question is whether our young people, the next generation, are going to be really smart consumers of information or not. And the jury's out, and it's up to us. So the fake news problem is hitting us now because we're actually very vulnerable, because the world has changed in the last 10 years. We're really vulnerable, and we've learned a lot from the Russia attack. Putin may have done us he did us a big disservice last year, but he may have given us a medium-term service.
That's a great point.
So the thing is, how do we respond? And that's up in the air, but that involves all of us.
Yes, front row, please.
So you all struck a note of optimism of how we've survived the first year. You put on your tiara of optimism, Corey.
How come I don't get one? Just you?
Deep State Radio, since you.
It's a running joke.
But there was, David, you talked about the lack of signal belief in diplomacy, and there is one institution that, because of the president's attack on it, and maybe because the Secretary of State is not governing it wisely, seems to not be surviving the stress test, has major vacancies, everybody's dejected over there, and foreign capitals are trying to circumvent the State Department. We used to have, in your administration, you guys would send Jake Sullivan over for secret missions, and they're sending Jared Kushner. So,
Yeah, he's involved in a lot of secret missions.
Can we survive even one more year of this stress test on the State Department? If the State Department goes in this trend, what does that mean for the next presidency and future of American leadership?
So this is a subject near and dear to my heart, as you know, but I actually think it's not nearly as dire as the reporting about Secretary Tillerson's poor leadership of the department and the dejectedness of the Foreign Service. Because, the Foreign Service always complains that every administration appoints all these political ambassadors and they get in the way of the Foreign Service doing their job. None of those political ambassadors have been appointed, right? The field is clear for the deputy's chief of mission to go do their job. And by the way, they're doing it extraordinarily well. They're doing it at a disadvantage, namely, it's hard to go in as a DCM and see the president of Turkey and really carry the weight of the United States. But it's also true that just as technology is changing communications, it's also changing diplomacy, right? Most of the high policy stuff that needs to get done does not get done with American ambassadors in foreign capitals. It gets done in Washington. What we need the Foreign Service to be brilliant at, and the Foreign Service is brilliant at, is going out into other societies and getting away from the government, getting to know the people, getting to engage with civil society, getting to be emissaries of the United States. And that has not changed. And the Foreign Service is doing that magnificently, despite the difficulties that they are experiencing in this administration. I would be a lot more worried about the intelligence community's morale and ability to do their job under this president. He's been much more forcefully damaging to them than he has been to diplomacy.
The one thing that, I travel, you travel, we all travel, and you talk to people in other capitals, and they say, we don't really know who to talk to. There's no, there's not an assistant secretary there. We used to know who we were supposed to talk to. We don't even know who to talk to. That's worrisome. Second thing is, and it's related. It's a little off topic, but I want to get it off my chest. It is important that we get out into these, in the world and engage in civil society and so on. It is also important to send a consistent message about American values. And if you're willing to, if you're all about human rights and democratic values in Iran, but you're a warm friend of Duterte, or you embrace Erdogan's crackdown in Turkey, or send these messages around the world that autocracy is okay so long as you're okay with us, then it makes it more difficult to play the role that America's played.
Unquestionably true, but this is not the first American administration in which that has been the case. The messages, for example, that the Obama administration sent on democracy promotion in Iran were also not that clear and consistent. So I think actually the world doesn't expect the kind of clarity that you are holding the administration.
That's a discussion we could have. Ivo, you could probably join in that discussion as well. I would say that, because I remember, the Green Revolution and at that time, and I remember the counsel that the president got, which is if you make this an American fight, you're going to make America, you're going to make it more difficult for those who are trying to promote democracy in Iran, not less difficult, and you're going to hinder those people who are fighting for that within their hobbled democratic system. So it may have been the wrong counsel, but I don't think that it's comparable to giving Duterte a big thumbs up for what he's doing, for being the only Western leader to get in touch with Erdogan after he passed a constitutional.
I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. Fine.
We have about 5 minutes remaining for our program, so we have time for one more question. Ma'am, in the back corner of the room, please. And a microphone is on its way.
Hi. I just want to know, you're all talking about this first year and leadership overseas. I'm retired Foreign Service, and what I think is it's great for now. They all know who Trump is. But what about next year? Will they ever get tired of dealing with him on this level and just say, screw you?
I think you already see the signs of America's friends hedging against the unreliability of the president's judgments, the unreliability of American commitments under the president. So I think that's actually already happening. The question, the residual is how much people trust the limited latitude that any American president has. I think Congress's action on sanctions on Russia, for example, sent a very welcome and powerful symbol. And I think the multiplicity of voices that people outside the United States hear from us is actually also helpful, because what What foreigners are trying to gauge is, to what extent is Donald Trump an anomaly, somebody who crested a wave at a particular moment, and to what extent does he represent what the United States has become? And to the extent that people who are not Duterte and not Erdogan and not Putin think that the United States that Donald Trump accurately reflects who we are and where we're going, that will accelerate that hedging against American policy.
I would just also repeat what I said earlier, which is that they all have local, they have their own domestic political concerns. So it becomes uncomfortable for Theresa May to embrace Donald Trump when he is hated in her country, and that is true among other leaders as well. So if you make yourself horribly unpopular, it makes it more difficult for those leaders to do things with you that you want them to do.
Imagine if President Trump had to do what George H.W. Bush did in 1990, which is go around the world and build a coalition to enforce a global norm. We wouldn't get our closest allies, much less the marginal countries who would uphold the order. It gets a lot
The
more
vote on
costly.
Jerusalem at the UN was instructive in that regard.
Perfect
We
example.
often don't know that we need other countries until we need them. And 9/11, after 9/11, the world embraced us. We've forgotten that, unfortunately. I want to say two things. One is that there's a lattice, I think of international relations as a lattice structure, and there are a lot of secret, confidential relationships that go on all the time. I would like to know more about those. One of those would be intelligence sharing. Are those still going on regardless of the president? Does it matter that it's Trump? Is there enough confidence for there to be the kind of military-to-military relationships and the intelligence-to-intelligence relationships? I don't know, but that's the way I would assess the real stress to the system.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. We hope you will stay for a reception and a book signing. The panelists' books are for sale by the bookseller near the exit. We will be setting up tables in the back, so if you have a book you would like signed, please feel free to join us in the back, and we do have a cash bar as well. Now, please join me in thanking David Axelrod, Mckay Coppins, Tim Naftali, and Corey Shockey.